welcome back to the Max Out Show, which today I'm joined by the two-time world champion and Olympic silver medalist in rowing, Annie Vernon. After incredibly successful 10 years, Annie is taking her interest in peak performance and studying many of the world's greatest athletes for a phenomenal book, Mind Games, trying to understand what sets them apart from the rest of the field. And that's exactly what we'll talk about today. The psychology of an elite athlete and how to bring that to every single area of your life. So Annie, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here.
I'm so excited to have you. And so one idea or construct that really struck me was this inherent competitiveness to life that can both express our best and the worst in us. So can you share with us a little bit why, competitiveness is such an inherent aspect of life?
Well, I mean, to sound like I'm quoting a cliche, we are called the human race, and so much of just the way that society is structured, forgetting about sport for a second, but everything from education to, the job market to careers to salaries, it's all a competition. You're always competing against someone else or competing against yourself to get to the next step. And I think the thing about competition is of course, it brings out the best in us. You can't say that it doesn't. I'm sure all of us have had a really stressful experience, perhaps a job interview that we're really worried about. And then we come out and we say, wow, I performed better than I could ever have imagined. Well, it was the stress and the pressure of that moment of competition that brought that out of you. To jump into sport again, people don't set world records in training. They set world records in Olympic finals.
Yeah.
And that's the reality of it. Usain Bolt isn't going to run 9.58 seconds on a rainy Thursday morning in January. He's going to run that at the World Championship final or the Olympic final. So of course, competition brings out the best in us, and we need it to spur us on. But at the same time, competition has a dark side. If you feel like you're always competing, if you feel like you're always under the microscope and always being judged, either against other people or just against a previous or an idealized version of yourself, that is destructive and that can break you down. And I think the answer is, like so much in life, is there's a balance there somewhere. And what we need is competition in moderation. So it is there, and it does, we do have those big moments where everything's expected of us, but it doesn't pervade into everyday life. And there are moments and there is times when we can just fail and it's okay, and we can be not very good and it doesn't matter. And we feel like we can make mistakes and roll the dice and risk it because there's no consequences. So there has to be, I think, some competition, but it cannot take over your life.
Yeah, for sure. And there's this great story in your book about this dark side of Chrissy Wellington, right? Who set the Ironman world record in 2011. And then when she called the coach, she's like, well, but my bike ride wasn't that great, right? Like you just became like the best of all time, right?
Exactly. I think the way that Dave Scott, her coach, phrased it is that, there's no such thing as perfection, but if you win the World Championships you don't win the World Championships, that was at a different event. If you set a new world record, there's a pretty much as close to perfect as you're going to get.
Yeah.
And I think, as an athlete, it's tempting to always think, that's fine, but I can do better. I can do better. And you know what? There's moments when you just need to give yourself a break and say, yeah, I could do better, but I did pretty darn well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it ties into this aspect of like mental health and happiness and relation to sports, right? Because we have these like inevitable like ups and downs, right? And the ups are amazing and the downs are even more devastating. So what have you learned really about handling sort of those really high like highs and the low lows?
Well, I think sport is probably the most extreme example of that. And certainly when I was a young athlete starting out my rowing career, one of my friends said to me, she said, in elite sport, the highs are very high and the lows are very low. And I guess that is the thing about elite sport that I now, and I've been retired for 8 years, I miss the most, and I don't miss at all. It's probably the bit that sometimes I think, God, I wish I was living my life in those extremes again. And then there's other days I think, I'm so glad I'm not living in those extremes anymore. And, the highs are good and the lows are not so good, but that's so much better than that roller coaster of emotion that you go through in sport. And I think, and I don't really think I have the right answer to this, other than you know, if researching mind games taught me anything, it's that people find out their own way of dealing with that. You know, people find out their own way of coping with those, you know, those massive highs and that feeling that you stood on top of the mountain, where else is there to climb to? And also those terrible lows when everything is snatched away from you and, you know, you mess up and suddenly that's it, another 4 years before you can put it right, if at all. So I think everybody, you know, goes through their own process of understanding that both those sides of elite sport exist, and some of them are nice, some of them are not very nice, but that's kind of how the cookie crumbles, and you have to be able to deal with those extremes, and you learn as a human how to deal with them.
Yeah, for sure. You know, a couple of weeks ago, I had Tony Jeffries on the show, fellow Great Britain Olympic medalist in boxing, right? And he was sharing the story of how, like, when he won that like Olympic bronze medal, it was like the greatest experience of his life, right? He said like it was, you know, more like fulfilling, more exciting than like, you know, getting married and you know, all that stuff. He was like, this is literally the high point of life. Yeah, I was like, don't tell it to her, but. No, it's just funny, right? Because like it speaks to this like these intense emotions that you experience when you're like at the top of the field, right? And then
yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. I think, you know, when you've climbed to the top of the mountain, what else is there to do? Where else is there to go? And yeah, some people really struggle with life after huge success, in the same way some people really struggle with life after terrible lows. And I think it you know, it almost comes down to, you have to remember that sport isn't real. Sport is something that you do. It doesn't define who you are. And there is a life after sport that will go on for decades and decades. I mean, I've excuse me, I've been retired now for the same amount of time that I've been an athlete, but it felt like my athletic career lasted for much longer than my post-athletic career has done, because it was so intense and it was so extreme, and it was, you know, so clearly etched in my memory every single moment. So I think you can't pretend that sport at the elite level doesn't affect you. It really does affect you. But it's not real. It's a bubble. You step into it and you step out again. And it's life on the outside that you need to be ready for.
Yeah, you know, I love what you just said here about, you know, those experiences really being etched in your memory, right? Because like I remember when I was, you know, running competitively, I also did it for about 8 years or so, right? And looking back, I can literally define my like the entire year basically by how well I ran, or by like, you know, the three best performances of the year. So like you tell me 2017, I can literally tell you this and this and this, like, and those are sort of the things that stick out. And I think that's so fascinating, right? That like we oftentimes, I talk to a lot of athletes that have the same thing, right? Like you define an entire year by like these, you know, 20 minutes of competition, right? That actually like were the time when you really were alive, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because actually in sport, that is how you're judged, you know? So, you know, now in my career that I have, or, you know, I have a 1-year-old, sorry, a 2-year-old, it's just turned 2. I don't necessarily, I mean, I have lots of wonderful times, you know, with my little boy, but there's no 1 or 2 moments where I say, that was the moment I was an amazing mother, because that's just not the way it works. Whereas I look back at my rowing career and I say, right, when I won the World Championships this year with this race, that was amazing. And it really is, you know, in sport, it does come down to those, you know, those one moment per year, or a handful of moments per year, that you do judge the whole, you know, you do judge your whole career on, really. And in my sport, in rowing, it's a 2,000 meter race, and depending on the size of the boat that you're in, it could be anything from 5.5 minutes to about 7 minutes. And, you know, you're talking, let's say it's so in the quad scull, which is what I spent most of my career in, it's just over 6-minute race. You think, gosh, all those hours, all that training, all that emotion, 6 minutes. I mean, we've been talking for longer than 6 minutes already, but these aren't the 6 minutes I'm going to define a whole year by. So, you know, people who do throwing events, sprinting events, it's seconds.
It's even less, right?
It is, and you think, gosh, so much of what you do and how much you care is wrapped up in those few seconds. But that's the nature of the beast. You know, if you don't like that, stay out of the kitchen. That's what you sign up for. You know, if you don't want those one-off moments where everything is asked of you and you are tested, you know, you put your iron in the fire, then don't go in sport, because you won't get on.
Yeah. So what have you learned about that drive? Like what actually, pushes people like you and all the other people you've interviewed like into this danger zone as you called it, right? Well, like you are in that place where you can get hurt. You're in that place where you like put everything on the line and you either win big or you lose big.
Mm. I think you've got to be a bit mad to start with. And I mean that, I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that in a really positive way. You've got to be, I don't know, I think of the people that I've met through sport, both, teammates in their own team and people from other sports and other countries. Everyone's just really unique and really individual, and definitely has a screw loose. But I think you once you're in it, and I guess this is something that came through really strongly in mind games. You learn to love it. Once you're in it, you self-justify. You tell yourself, "Well, this is great. I haven't been had a night out in months. I'm 25 and I haven't drunk alcohol in a year or whatever it is. I'm living this really strange life, distinct from all my friends. And I meet someone and I go on a date, and it just doesn't work because I can't explain my life to them. But you self-justify. You say, "But this is great. This is exactly what I want." So you create your own reality as an athlete. You create your own version of what is right, what is wrong. I mean, I've heard people say that there's all these areas of overlap between elite sports people and convicted criminals and serial killers, because there's this same process that you normalize what you're doing. What you're doing is so weird and so different from most people. You come up with ways of normalizing it and making it suit you as a person and convincing yourself this is exactly what you want to do. And it isn't really till it's all over you look back and you say, "Gosh, that was strange, wasn't it?" But at the time, yeah, you start off with just that, that love for your sport. You start off with the curiosity. I wonder how good I could be. You start off with probably a question mark. I wonder how hard can I push myself today? Actually, maybe I want to take the next step and do British trials, or take the next step and go to national championships, whatever it is in your sport. And then before you know it, you're on the treadmill. But you don't, and when you get off the treadmill, you're a very different person to how you started, because you've trained those mental skills, you've trained your personality. But to start off with, you've got to be an outstanding athlete. You've got to have just that tiny spark of curiosity. I want to know what I can do. And that's enough to set you on your way.
Yeah, this nature of like sacrifice is so interesting to me, because like you said, like when you're in this zone, like you just live such a fundamentally different life from like the way that the normal person, consider quote unquote normal person, lives. It's just like people don't understand, right? That like you go to a party and like you leave at 9 p.m. because you need to sleep, right? That you don't drink alcohol, that you don't eat junk food. Like it's just something that is like so far away from like the way that most people live. So
yeah, but I think the word you use there is probably a word that most elite athletes wouldn't use, and that's sacrifice.
yeah.
Most elite athletes would say, "I haven't sacrificed anything. I've made
It
a
doesn't
choice.
feel like it.
I've made a positive choice to live this lifestyle. And what do I get in return? I get to represent my country at sport. I mean, what could be better than that?" I'm not saying you have that attitude all the time. Sometimes you do think, "I am sacrificing."
Yeah.
I mean, you miss weddings of really close friends, and you think this isn't fun. But the vast majority of time, you think, "I'm so privileged. Look what I get to do." There's so many people who try to do this and can't. They're not quite good enough, and I'm so lucky that I am just about good enough to do it. So I think the moment you start seeing it as a sacrifice is the moment that you're probably in the wrong job.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I'm so curious, right? Because like this, like like what you just mentioned, right? It's like the thing that all makes it worth it, right? It's like getting some kind of end result out of it, right? Like it's not necessarily always a pleasurable pursuit, but it's like oftentimes when you have that big dream, like that's what like you keep striving for, right? So like for you,
I don't know. See, I'm not sure many people. I'm sure not everyone would agree with you there. I think for a lot of people that it is about the big moment and about like you say, getting something back. And I think most people probably say it's not. Most people would say it is about the journey. It's about the effort, the striving, the commitment. It's the things you do along the way rather than necessarily the outcome. But I don't know. I'm just speaking for myself. I'm not sure.
No, for sure. There's a balance, right? And like people are very different. And I think that's one of the key takeaways. But sort of the question I was trying to point at is like, would you feel looking back, if you hadn't won like the world championships, for example, would you have felt like it was all worth it?
Gosh, I don't know. It's a pretty big question. I don't know. The thing is, I guess in those situations when I won, when I won some medals, I was good enough. So I felt like I achieved my potential. Whereas I think the thing that would keep me up at night now would be if I hadn't achieved my potential. I believe I was good enough to win Olympic gold. I didn't quite manage it. I came away with the silver, but so that is a source of huge frustration for me. But I kind of look back and I say, yeah, but I won lots of other races. So overall, I think I achieved my potential. Whereas if I'd perhaps, never quite been at that standard, and I come away with just a few fifth place finishes, but if that's where I felt was reflective of my ability, because I think as an athlete, the only thing you want to do is do your best.
Yeah.
That's all you want to do. You just want to go to bed at night and say, did everything I could. I didn't leave a single stone unturned. I think the moment you start having regrets and I wish things could have been different, the times that you screw up and you've got no one to blame but yourself. And you meet a heck of a lot of athletes who are really bitter and really wound up about something that happened a decade ago because they felt like they never quite achieved their potential, and they can't quite move on from that.
Yeah, that's interesting. And like looking back, even for me, I realized that like the things that I regret most is like the times when I didn't like push myself to like the maximum, right? It's like I remember those races where like I just knew there was more potential, but I didn't like somehow manage to get it out of myself that day. So it wasn't like I lost that race because I was not talented enough. I lost that race because I just didn't give them all. And those are really the things I found that tend to bug you for a long time.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's the things where you've got no one to blame but yourself.
Yeah.
Particularly in a team sport like rowing, there's a lot of people involved. And I'm not saying you blame other people, but you're aware you're part of a team effort. Your input is a small part of the total. The coach has a really dominant role in rowing. So there's a lot of other things going on. Whereas there are occasions when there's nowhere to look but yourself. You're the one who made that mistake. You're the one who let yourself down, and those are the worst moments.
Now, you mentioned before that athletes to do this at such a high level have to be in a certain way kind of mad. And I think and you pointed to some really fascinating research about some of those painkillers that are released in our bodies that actually make us feel good rather than bad after practice. So can you share with us a little bit about that?
Yeah, pain is something that I was really interested in because I feel like pain is such a big barrier in all endurance sports. I don't just mean in rowing. In all endurance sports, you have to push yourself physically. I'm a big cycling fan, and until recently, I cycle quite a lot. And what you put yourself through going up a big hill, or you watch professional cyclists in the Tour de France, and they are absolutely killing themselves going up these 20k climbs in the Alps. And it really, really hurts. Yeah. And I think it hurts the more trained you are. So if I cycle up a massive hill now, it wouldn't hurt that much because I couldn't physically push myself because, I have no fitness because I'm very pregnant. Whereas when I was a full-time athlete, for our big sessions, I could really push myself, to vomiting, close to passing out. And it's horrible. It is a horrible thing to put yourself on. And I'm sure everyone who does endurance sports listen to this will be nodding their head at this point and saying, yeah, I totally get it. Exercise-induced pain, lactic acid, that feeling of blood at the back of your throat. It's a horrible feeling. And I guess it really interested me because I also felt that it's not something that's ever really addressed in psychology. Psychologists just seem to assume that you can do it, you can push yourself through pain, whereas actually it's such a big barrier. Before a race, that's kind of the main thing you're thinking about is, this is going to hurt so much. Yeah. So I suppose it interested me enough that when I sat down to write the book, I thought I want to find out more about exercise-induced pain. So I kind of asked a few contacts in the medical world and was put in touch with a professor of pain at Imperial College London, which is just the best job title ever. And as it happened, he has an interest in rowing, which was perfect. So I went and chatted to him about pain, and he sort of said, we don't really understand pain as much as we'd like to, because how can you recreate it in a laboratory? You can't bring someone in and hurt them and then ask them questions about it.
Yeah, you can't like shock them constantly.
No. That's been done in the past.
Yeah.
It's not ideal. People wouldn't do it, and ethically, you couldn't do it as well as a researcher. So he said exercise-induced pain is an area that's really hard to research. But he said we know a bit about the mechanism of pain-killing processes, and essentially it's a byproduct of the natural painkillers in your body is a positive feeling. You know, people say you get the endorphin response, but endorphins is a byproduct of your natural painkillers. So essentially, pain and pleasure are confused in sport. You know, you feel good after you've inflicted the pain on yourself, which is why it was always self-perpetuating. And the other thing he said is that, you know, pain is highly highly psychological. I mean, he used the example of people who get their foot shot off on the battlefield, yet they can still run to safety. And the second they're, you know, back in camp or behind a wall or whatever, they collapse to the floor in, you know, unbelievable pain, and they can't walk from then on. But for that moment, they could do it. And he said, clearly, our brains have a huge impact in how we process pain. And he sort of said there's this theory called the gate theory, which is that, you know, pain happens somewhere in your body. So in sport, it'll be lactic acid in your leg muscles in rowing. It comes up your spinal column to your brain, and your brain then decides what to do with it. So essentially, you can train your ability to not listen to those signals, as it were. Well, not that you not listen to them, but you know, you can almost train your ability to turn them down. So you can turn down the pain feeling, which I guess chimed with my experience, because I felt that processing exercise-induced pain was definitely something I got better at through my career. And also looking around the rowing team, there were certainly people who were much better than others at putting themselves in, you know, the pain locker. And I guess that always really interested me, because how can you be better than me at just this basic biological response? But it turns out it's not biological. There is a psychological aspect to it. And it was quite interesting, actually, because then he started talking about, you know, the pain of having a baby, which is obviously something that a lot of women go through. And at that point, I was pregnant with my first child. And I said, I don't really want to talk about this right now.
Oh, yeah. Don't want to hear it.
I've got all this ahead of me. I don't want to talk about childbirth pain. Thanks. So yeah, so that was just really interesting. And I guess it's another thing I really wish I'd known when I was still rowing.
Yeah, for sure. I love that. In fact, in running, oftentimes there's this phrase that says like, "Oh, this hurts so good," right? Like.
Yeah, but it's not, you know. And of course, you can try and convince yourself, and you can find a way of dealing with it, and everyone will find their own way of dealing with it, whatever it is. But I don't think it ever gets enjoyable.
Yeah.
I mean, for some, I'm going to backtrack. There's a few total nutters out there who probably love that feeling of really hurting themselves doing sport. But I think for most people, it's just a means to an end. It's not a nice end in itself.
Yeah, for sure. So what were some of those strategies or techniques that you used to really win this battle with fatigue and pain?
With pain? Well, I guess it was something that, because my career was about 9 years, so it took in 2 full Olympic cycles. So I very much divided my career into 2, and I was quite a different person between the 2, and quite a different athlete, because, you know, you just learn so much from going to one Olympic Games. You know, it opens your eyes to everything about sport. So I think the first 4 years I just took it for granted that, you know, rowing was going to really hurt, training was going to hurt, and you just got on with it. And then the second 4 years, I guess I thought, well, how can I get better at maximising my performance in this way? So I decided to really focus on it as an end in itself. You know, how close can I get to collapse? And just ask those questions of myself. You know, physically, how hard can I push myself? And always treat it as a kind of an academic question, rather than, oh, this is just a byproduct of training. But actually, okay, it's going to really hurt. Let's see how good we can get at just not relishing it, but getting as close to that red line as possible. Which again, I think it probably objectified things for me and made it easier to cope with.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely love that. Now, one thing that is absolutely devastating for athletes is self-doubt. It can oftentimes be very crippling for people. And now you have your own story of overcoming that throughout your career. So can you share that story with us?
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, people talk about imposter syndrome, and I don't think anyone in the world wouldn't suffer from imposter syndrome at times, particularly in international sport, where it's different to most professions in that it's public. So you, as a sporty kid, would have grown up watching the Olympic Games, watching the World Athletics Championships, watching the Football World Cup, whatever it is. So you've seen other people on telly in the public eye do what you're now doing. So, you're literally putting yourselves in the shoes of your heroes. So I think in sport it's easier to feel like an imposter, because perhaps in other professions, other jobs, you haven't necessarily, if it's not public, you haven't necessarily seen anyone else do it, so you're kind of doing it for the first time. Whereas in sport, you've watched all these amazing athletes come before you, and suddenly you're the one following them. And you think, hang on a sec, I'm just some little kid from Cornwall. What am I doing competing for Great Britain? And I think women struggle with that more than men as well. I think women have less innate self-confidence. They can take a bit more evidence to persuade them that they are at the right standard, on the right ballpark, and certainly in the right job. And for me, it was probably quite a few years where, and it's not something I really addressed, but I just, was doing my thing. And it wasn't until it was my second senior world championships, and my teammate and I were in a 2-person boat. We came fourth by tiny margin. And after that, we both went through some pretty big soul searching, because we should certainly have been on the podium. We could certainly have won a bronze or a silver in that race. Not a gold, but certainly bronze or silver. And after that race, we asked ourselves lots of questions. What went wrong? Why didn't we go faster? Why didn't we really have a great relationship? Why didn't we get on with our coach? Why did we have such a yo-yo season where we had some amazing races and some terrible performances? But I think one of the questions I asked myself was, well, did you sit on that start line actually believing you could be on the podium at the end of the race? And I thought to myself, no, not at all. So then my next question was, well, why not? And also, is that important? And I thought, well, what's the point in doing this job, training this hard, not sacrificing, committing my whole life to my sport, if I don't actually think I'm that good at it? And to me, I then thought, well, if I don't believe that I can be an athlete on the podium, why am I putting myself through this 6 hours a day, 6 days a week, 11 months a year? This is pointless. This is like, I don't know, going and trying to do your driving test without thinking you can drive. So then I thought, well, okay, what do I do? And I just figured all this stuff out for myself. I didn't go and see our psychologist at that point, although obviously I wish I had. And I really just visualized myself just by stepping off the edge of a cliff and thinking, there isn't any evidence that I'm good enough to win. There's no, it's not written in the stars. I'm just going to have to start believing. And I guess it's probably, people who believe in all the kind of rubbish fake news you read on the internet, they just start believing in it, and then you convince yourself. It's the ultimate conspiracy theory. You always decide you agree with the theory, and then you convince yourself of the reality around you to fit the theory. Whereas clearly in science, you start off with the evidence and then you arrive at the theory. But I wended it the other way around, because I thought, I'm only going to get one chance at this. I'm not going to be able to come back and redo it all. If I don't go, I'm not going to be able to rewind the clock to be 22 again and have another go at sport. So I thought, right, let's just shut my eyes, step off the cliff, and start telling myself that I can be a world champion next year. And I did. And I'm not saying it was an overnight thing. I didn't suddenly flick a switch and say, yep, September 2007, I'm going to be a world champion. But gradually, over the next few months, I started telling myself it, trying to fit the evidence around me to make myself believe this, try to train with the assurance of it. Essentially, I just imagined a parallel universe where this had already happened, this had already played out. I'd been to the World Championships, I'd won the gold medal, and here I was doing the season again. And eventually, I convinced myself of my own hype, as they say. And by the time, we got to the busiest end of the season, I genuinely did think, yeah, I can do this. I can absolutely win the World Championships. And obviously the postscript of the story is that I did win the World Championships, and I don't think I could have without having that innate belief. Clearly it could have gone a different way and I couldn't have done it, but I like to think I would have still believed that I could do it. I believe that theoretically, if everything goes my way, it is possible for me to win the World Championships. Whereas up until that point, I'd never thought that. I'd think even if I have the race of my life, I'm still not quite there. So I guess, and it was those two words that I kept using: good enough. I'm good enough. I'm good enough to do it. I'm good enough to be here. I'm good enough to win this medal.
Wow, I love this so much. So what did that process look like for you? Was it affirmations? Was it sort of, writing things down? Was it just constant reminding yourself of I'm good enough, I can do this? What did it look like for you?
Well, I think it's all sorts, and I suppose that was also what I was trying to examine in mind games is how people do that. What evidence do they use? What cues do they give themselves? What people do they surround themselves with? Who do they speak to? Do you read books? Do you listen to podcasts? Whatever it is, you've got to set yourself up an environment where you've got all these bombarded with all this noise telling you the right things you need to hear. And if you aren't hearing the right noises, then change the channel so you are, because you only get one chance in that sport. You can't go back and do it again. I mean, yeah, you might go to another Olympics, but the window for your performance is so tiny. I mean, most people do it for 5-10 years. It's such a small amount of time. And I thought there's no point spending those 5-10 years not quite believing. I have to believe. That has to be the absolute core. It has to be, if you strip away everything about me, you'll be left with just, in my heart, a person who believes they're good enough to be a world champion. And I felt like that had to be the foundation of everything I did. So yeah, it was self-talk. It was trying to take the evidence around me. It was also telling people, I remember sitting down with my coach and saying, I'm going to be a world champion next year. And I think he was quite surprised, because I don't think he necessarily believed it. But he said, oh, right, okay, right. And for me, kind of externalizing it and putting it out there and saying it to somebody else, that just made it real.
Yeah, do you feel like that just added another layer of sort of accountability and having sort of putting that pressure on you?
Sure. Yeah, and it clearly stuck in his mind, because he did bring it up a few times throughout the season. If I was having a wobble or things weren't going to plan, he said to me, Annie, you said you were going to be a world champion. Do you still believe that? And I'd say, yeah, I do actually. Yeah. And he'd say, right, great. And that was it. It's just like a little kind of pat on the shoulder. So but yeah, this was the reality that I created for myself. Was it based in fact? No. But that was the reality that I needed to believe.
Yeah, I love this so much, this idea of belief, right? Because only when you truly believe that you can achieve that thing, are you going to actually expand the effort towards it, right?
For sure. And I think a lot of people, they need more evidence. So I think a lot of athletes will need more either results, time, scores, PBs, or they'll need other people to tell them, you can do this, you can do this. Whereas, I'm quite an introvert, so I'm, pretty self-referencing, and that's the way I operate, and that's how my mind works. So I knew that I needed to start with my own kind of version of myself, and then build on that.
Yeah, I love that. Now, you mentioned this before, this idea that you have about 5 to 10 years really as a professional athlete, and in that time you have maybe 2 Olympic cycles, you have maybe 5 whatever how many world championships. How do you make sure that in those moments, and you mentioned before it takes about 6 minutes for you to perform this race, how do you make sure that when it's that time of the year when you got these 6 minutes and they literally determine whether this year was successful or not, how do you show up as your best and really perform to the maximum of your ability there?
Well, I think you build up to it the same way you build up your training. I mean, 12 months out from the World Championships, are you in a position to race a flat out 2,000 meter race, against 6 other crews? No, not at all. You're nowhere near that level of ability, that level of performance. In the same way, 12 months out, are you ready to put yourself in that pressure cooker? No, definitely not. But you build up to it over the months, it gets closer, and actually you often find that a month out you'll still be thinking, God, I'm so not ready for this, there's so much more I need to do. And then a week before the event you'll be thinking, actually, yeah, I'm ready, let's go for it. So I think you accept that preparing for something physically doesn't happen overnight, in the same way preparing for something mentally doesn't happen overnight. And you almost just let your body, let your mind develop and change and build itself up, so that by the time you get to that start line, you're sat there, actually you feel pretty happy, you feel pretty satisfied.
Yeah, for sure. Love that. Now, one thing that was so fascinating about your book is the sort of narrative that people thread through their career. And you talked about this before with the self-referencing, right? But like what you found actually is like the background almost doesn't matter, right? Like the, where people come from, rich, poor, this neighborhood, that neighborhood. Like it's really the narrative that people create around their background, around their story.
Yeah,
So
for
how
sure.
can people then develop a more empowering sort of narrative around their life that actually helps them really go for it?
I think so much of it is about figuring out what works for you. The way that I went about my mental skills in sport, totally different to anyone else. And that's the reality of humans. We're all unique. There's whatever, 6 billion of us on the planet. Every single one of us is different. So I would say start with you. Who are you? What excites you? What terrifies you? What do you know you're good at? What don't you know you're good at? What aren't you very good at? And almost just hold a mirror up to your personality and say, okay, what's going on here? What do we need to do? And just get to know yourself inside out. In the same way that, I don't know, you meet a new partner, husband, girlfriend, boyfriend, wife, and you get to know them. You get to know them really well. So just make sure you get to know yourself. And it's that self-awareness piece that when I was researching mind games, that came across so strongly. Every single athlete had been through that process of self-examination, self-awareness. So they knew how they operated. They knew how they ticked. They knew that, I don't know, let's take it even to the morning of your Olympic final. Some people will sit there, headphones on, Rage Against the Machine playing, Hard House, whatever it is. Usain Bolt famously goes out and gets chicken nuggets before he races, the big races. So everyone will go about it in a different way. Some people will chat to everyone else. Some people will be quite solitary. Everyone has a different way of building themselves up for the big moment. So just broaden that out and have that approach to what you're doing in life. Your approach to your work, your family, your exercise, that work-life balance. It'll work differently for everyone. And there's nothing wrong with that. Just make sure the way you're doing things works for you, because all of us are different. You'll probably do it in a different way to your partner, to your spouse, even. And I think that's part of the excitement of life, is we all are so unique.
Yeah, I love that piece of self-awareness. I think that's so crucial. And I think it really comes through in the book, right? That like there's so many different approaches to how you can do it, quote unquote, right? There's no one single thing. It's just like
no way.
specific.
No way.
Yeah, for sure. Now, if you could, go back in time to your, 22-year-old self starting out, what would be like a piece of advice that you would give to yourself, and maybe, other athletes starting out their careers right now, that you had to learn sort of throughout that career?
Definitely, it would be that it's okay to fail. Failing at sport doesn't mean you are a failure. It just means you weren't very good at that sport that day. And the British rowing team, when I was on it, it's changed a heck of a lot in the last 8 years. There's been quite a lot of personnel have moved on, new people have come in. But certainly when I was there, the attitude was very much, if you lose, you are a complete loser. If you haven't won Olympic medals, don't bother showing your face. And everything was kind of organised around, if you're successful, you're the best people here. And I think I very much got swept into that. And I think if I was going back, I'd say to myself, just ignore that all. You're doing this to have fun and to achieve things and push yourself and enjoy it. And if you fail, it's fine. It really doesn't reflect on you as a person. And I think it wasn't until I retired really that I realized that.
Yeah, for sure. This already leads me to my next question, because one question I ask every single one of my guests is their favorite failure. So do you, throughout your career, have a favorite failure that later on and really pushed you to become a better version of yourself?
Well, I don't know. I guess I divide all my, all the times I messed up or the times I underperformed. I guess I divide them into two. There was some that I really did learn from, and like I described earlier, the time we came fourth, it was just such a huge, hugely revealing moment for me, because it really did make me think. And I honestly think if we'd been a tenth of a second faster and won a bronze medal, I probably wouldn't have gone on to the success I did, because it really did lift the wool from my eyes and enable me to understand all the things I'd done wrong, but that I was doing wrong. But I also think there's other times I've failed that actually there's nothing I can learn. There's no positive to take. you know, it was really depressing and it really upset me. And you know, and it's not being self-pitying. It's just sometimes bad stuff happens, and it's you can't find a positive, and it is what it is. You just take it on the chin and move on. And I think almost I spent too much time in the past trying to find, you know, the thing about it that spurred me on to you know, to get better. And a lot of the time there isn't one. A lot of the time you put everything into it, you do everything right, and you're just not quite good enough. Is there a positive in that? Not really. It's a bit depressing. But like I said, you know, that is sport. You know, you put yourself out there. So I think there's some failures you can learn from, and some failures you just say, it wasn't my day. I didn't enjoy that. It wasn't very nice. Let's crack on.
Yeah, for sure. And I think this process of like learning to move on, right? Even from those devastating failures that maybe you can't even learn anything about, right? It's just like it sucked today, but hey, better luck, you know, next time, next week, next race. I think is so important.
Yeah, and sometimes you don't get a next time. Sometimes that's it. Your career's over, and you think, well, am I going to beat myself up about that? No, I'm just going to say that was part of the kaleidoscope of life, and I'm sure there's lots of other things I'll do.
Yeah, for sure. Now, if you could give our listeners just one challenge, one action step to take away from this today, what would that be?
I think spend a bit of time. I mean, life is really strange at the moment with COVID-19. You know, life is definitely not normal, and in some ways we've all got a bit more thinking time on our hands. We certainly won't necessarily all have time on our hands if we're homeschooling children, but we've got time to think and just have that conversation with yourself. You know, hold up that mirror to your personality and say, well, who am I? What am I good at? What makes me happy? What environment do I need to create around me that gives me all the right messages and puts me in a really happy place? Because it'll be different for everyone. And actually, you know, life isn't necessarily about trying to do the next bigger, better thing. Sometimes life is just about, you know, setting up a life that works for you and makes you really happy day to day. So have a bit of time to think about that, and like I said, look in the mirror and see what you see.
Love that. Now, before I ask my final question, where can listeners connect with you online?
I'm on Twitter at Vernon GB. I'm on Instagram at the same handle, and you can get a copy of my book, Mind Games, in all the usual places: Waterstones, Amazon, Bloomsbury, and the publishers. You can get it from Bloomsbury. The paperback is coming out in July this year, and the hardback came out last year. So same book, different coloured covers.
Perfect. Now, what does it mean for you to max out your life?
I think it means maxing out my life means, I guess, a bit of what I've already said, just finding the right kind of life that suits you. I mean, my life now is totally different to when I was an athlete. Does it make me happier? You can't really compare the two. It's totally different. You know, my pace of life has changed, my priorities have changed, how I judge myself has changed. So I would say maxing out your life is really finding the right kind of life that works for you and living that to the max. But don't try and live somebody else's version of what's great and what's amazing.